Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 13 audio lecture for English 1010. And as I mentioned in last week's audio lecture, which was quite short, I assigned a couple of reading assignments last week, and there's an additional reading assignment for this week. I'll say a little something about how you can find that reading assignment, but I want to spend my time today and our time today discussing most of those reading assignments, the one that I assigned for this week and the two that I assigned last week, specifically focusing on how these different writers integrate and incorporate borrowed material. Because now that the benchmark assignment is finished, you will shift or transition to actually writing the research essay itself. And in addition to thinking about how you want to outline this particular essay, crafting a thoughtful and persuasive thesis, one of the most important things you will do in this research essay, and I think one of the things that this research essay hopes to teach you, is how to seamlessly, effectively, and in a readable way incorporate borrowed material. For this lecture, I'll spend most of my time discussing how to quote directly from the text, and as always, you can find additional information and documentation, examples, etc. in the research essay module, and I would also encourage you to avail yourself of those video resources in UJA. But the basics when thinking about directly quoting from the text, and here when I say direct quoting, what I mean, of course, is you are changing nothing. If something appears a particular way, if an author or set of authors use a particular set of words, when you borrow that material, you will reproduce it exactly as he, she, or they wrote it. And of course, you will do so using double quotation marks. But the thing that I find most students have difficulty perhaps understanding or mastering, at least at first, are the signal phrases that should appear before a quote and the parenthetical in-text citations that should appear after a quote. So let's start with those signal phrases. Think of a signal phrase, and it can be simple, but think of a signal phrase as language you want to use to introduce borrowed material. That could be something as simple as the author's name and a present tense verb, something like writes. So if we use, for example, someone like Kim Morgan, one of the authors for one of the reading assignments from last week, a simple signal phrase, again, let us imagine you are quoting from this essay, could read or sound something like this. Kim Morgan writes. You'll also find in the research essay module a PDF with a list of possible signal phrase verbs, because using the same verb, if you were to use a word like writes repeatedly, that might sound unnecessarily repetitive and perhaps a bit boring and tedious. So it may be a good idea to vary the signal phrase verbs you use. And what you'll also notice with that list, some verbs, a verb like writes, for example, tonally speaking is quite neutral, but let us imagine you want it to be a little more emphatic. You could use a verb like implores, for example. Again, you can see the list there. But what you would want, what you would need, the point is, when introducing borrowed material, specifically direct quotes, you would want that kind of a signal phrase. The thing that I would encourage you to avoid is simply beginning a sentence with a quote. Not only does that potentially confuse a reader, in the same way that if you were to imagine you're at a party or you're speaking to someone and then they just begin quoting something, think about how jarring and how unsettling that would be. You, as the person listening, would have very little information to help you understand what is happening in that moment. Even though a written essay is slightly different, the principle to some degree remains the same. By introducing a quote or by introducing borrowed material with a signal phrase, you are leading a reader into that borrowed material. Plus, it signals to your reader that they're about to read or absorb borrowed material. And because of that, again, it enhances the readability of your essay, which in turn enhances the credibility of your overarching argument or claim. Now, the second thing you need, and again, we're imagining you have successfully written this signal phrase, something like Kim Morgan, or whatever the author or authors' names are, and then a verb like writes. You quote directly from the text. You need then a citation in parentheses. That's why it is called an in-text parenthetical citation. The information that you need in this citation certainly varies depending on the information you have, what you know, what kind of source you're quoting, etc. But let us imagine you know, for example, the author's name, Kim Morgan. Again, we're using her as an example. And you also know the page number or numbers. Let us imagine you quote directly from page 1. What would need to appear in the in-text parenthetical citation is the author's last name, Morgan, followed by a space, followed by the number 1. What that indicates to a reader, because, and here I might want to pause and simply explain the logic behind the in-text parenthetical citation, what it does. So you'll notice, and you can see this with the examples, you can see this with most of the reading assignments that I have offered for the research essay unit. The full citation, all of the information that you as the reader would hypothetically or theoretically need if you wanted to find and confirm an author's source, you do not find that full citation within the body of the essay itself. That's something you find on the works cited page. What the in-text citation does, it gives your reader just enough information so they may then go to the works cited page to find the full citation, which they could then use that information to go and find your source. The theory or the logic here, at least from MLA's perspective, is to provide the necessary information within the body of the essay itself, but not to provide so much information that it distracts from or detracts from the readability of the essay itself. This is one of the reasons why the signal phrase is so important, because again, as I mentioned a moment ago, having signal phrases enhances the readability of your work. Having those citations also extremely important, because that's how you show your reader not only that you are borrowing from a secondary source, but it's also how you provide proof that you have done so. It's how you provide evidence that you're actually quoting from something that someone could find if you did not have those citations, or if those citations led to nothing. That would, again, potentially decrease the credibility of your essay, because it would suggest that either your quote is a fabrication, which is to say it's something you created, you're not actually quoting from a source, or it would cause your reader to question whether or not you know how to cite your sources correctly, which again, if that were the case, that would also theoretically decrease the credibility of your essay. So in summation, not only having these citations, but ensuring that they are correct is extremely important. And what you would do with your in-text citation, if you have, for example, the author's name and you know the page numbers, you would simply, or it could just be a page number. Let us imagine you quote from just one page of an essay, a chapter in a book, etc. You would provide the author's name, the page number. I, for example, could then go to your works cited page, which you would hopefully list everything alphabetically. If it's something, again, because we're using this Kim Morgan piece as an example, I would go to the M's, I would see Kim Morgan's name, I would see all of the necessary and pertinent information I would need to find that particular piece of information. And then if I wanted to, if I thought, for example, that you misquoted Morgan, if I thought, for example, that the quote didn't seem consistent with the context you establish, I could just always go and, at the very least, read the section of whether it's an essay or a chapter from a book or a book itself, I could read all of that information in context and arrive at some conclusion about the degree to which you successfully incorporated that borrowed material. So, signal phrases, you would use those, again, all of this in summation. Signal phrases, use those to introduce borrowed material. You would then have, if we're thinking of a direct quote, the borrowed material itself, followed by an in-text parenthetical citation. If you are using or quoting from or borrowing from an essay or a piece that does not have an author, again, you can find a lot of information about these possible variants, sources without authors in the research essay module, but at that point you would simply use an abbreviated version of the title, and hopefully all of that information would appear on your works cited page. So the way I like to imagine this, again, just in summation, is the information you provide in the body of the essay, the signal phrases, and the in-text citations, they have a relationship with the full citation on the works cited page. And what I would certainly encourage all of you not to do, do not incorporate borrowed material without both signal phrases and in-text citations, and just review the rules for what your in-text citations should read like, depending on the source itself. And what I would again encourage you to avoid, I see this occasionally with students, they are understandably a bit confused. So if it's a digital source, for example, they just provide a full URL in the in-text citation. Please do not do that. Email me if you have, and this is true for anyone and everyone. If you have questions about citing sources, please email me. I'm happy to offer guidance. But the one thing I would encourage you to do, well, two things I would encourage you not to do. Don't just ignore this part or facet of the research essay, because it's an essential part of this assignment, because this is how you are showing and demonstrating your knowledge and mastery of citing sources correctly. So avoid just doing nothing, of course, but also don't just provide a URL, because both of those options indicate that you have not either listened to these audio lectures, completed the reading assignments that I've asked you to complete, or reviewed the materials, whether they are written materials in the research essay module or the video content, that video material that I provided in UJA for this research essay module. So again, in summation, the thing you need to know, the thing you, I suspect, should understand is citing sources is extremely important. Citing them correctly is extremely important. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. There is a sort of predictable pattern here. While there are some differences depending on the kinds of sources you choose, want, or need to cite, what you might find, especially with MLA, is just a kind of predictability. So, okay, for now, I want to shift and say a few things about some of the reading assignments I've asked you to complete over the last couple of weeks. So let's start with the Kim Morgan piece. And you can see that as I'm recording this essay is a few decades old, but one of the reasons why I like to teach it and why I ask students to read it is because I think Morgan does a few things here that are potential options for all of you, for all of my students. One of them is the outline. Now, you'll notice from the prompt, there's no requirement for you to produce an outline, but I think this essay at the beginning offers a fantastic example of what a brief but useful outline can and should look like if this is something, because again, as you write, the bigger, the longer, and the more complex your essays become, you might find it becomes something of a necessity to start outlining your thoughts, your intentions, your ideas. And again, I think Morgan does this quite effectively. The other thing, and well, maybe three things, I know I often do this. The second thing This is a research essay, but as you read it, you might find yourself thinking there are these distinct narrative elements, and this is something that students, understandably so, think is probably not an option for a research essay. That is to say, they understandably think that, well, research, whatever this means, it's meant to feel objective, therefore, any potential, and my apologies, you can maybe hear my dog pit-pattering around, but they often think because a research essay aspires to be and attempts to be objective, there probably cannot be or should not be any personal narratives. But I think if executed correctly, if incorporated effectively, narrative and research can often work quite well together. But again, it just depends on the kind of essay you want to write. And I think just with just about anything, it also depends on how you do it. And Morgan does it quite well. Furthermore, the subject matter, which is to say what she chooses to write about, I think lends itself, or you could envision this topic lending itself quite well to the occasional personal narrative. So that's the second thing. We wrote a narrative essay earlier this semester, but what I would encourage all of you to think is all of the patterns that I've asked you to use, personal narrative, description, definition, classification, compare and contrast. There are other patterns of development. Many of them you have used without necessarily realizing it, like exemplification, using examples, process, explaining how to do something, cause and effect. All of these are patterns available to you, and you should use and deploy them as you like. But don't think that because we have now left, for example, the personal narrative essay behind, that you cannot use personal narrative. Many of you have done this progressively throughout the semester, and this is certainly an option for you with the research essay as well. The third thing that I think Morgan does quite well, and this harkens back to something that I spoke about earlier in this lecture, she so effectively incorporates borrowed material. If, for example, you look to page 2, here the first full paragraph, the one that begins with, "For years, doctors knew little about the disease," as a topic sentence, this is fantastic because it is clear, it is concise, it offers your reader a clear indication of what you, or in this essay, it offers the reader an indication of what this paragraph hopes to address. But then if you look a little farther down, and again, all of those parentheses, those are references to sources. Here, I'm looking at the very last one, the one that ends with the coping in quotation marks and the number 1. Let me read that sentence. Dementia patients were often thought to be, quote, senile or, quote, crazy. They were confined to their houses, in nursing homes, and even in mental hospitals. Notice the quotation marks around words like senile and crazy. So what that implies is those are potentially direct quotes, or that's language that appears in this source coping. I like how Morgan does this. So she quotes from, the implication is at least that she quotes from this source, but she's not over quoting. This is not, for example, multiple paragraphs from this source. And notice how she seamlessly blends this borrowed material with her own language. This is incredibly readable, and this is something all of you should aspire to do as well. When incorporating borrowed material, again, thinking back or hearkening back to what I said earlier, let us try to make this as readable as possible. And that's something Morgan does quite effectively here. You can also see in the following paragraphs, even though she has these longer block quotes, notice how she introduces them. The very next paragraph, the one that begins with dementia and Alzheimer's disease are very closely related in their symptoms and characteristics. The next sentence, David L. Carroll, a writer who specializes in healthy and medicine, explains in his book, when your loved one has Alzheimer's, how Alzheimer's affects a person's memory and personality. that is an excellent example of a signal phrase. She provides the author's name. She even does a little more. She offers, it's that language that language that's flanked by commas. She provides some credentials, which again helps to increase or enhance the credibility of this source. But notice as well the use of the verb explains here. So again, present tense explains. David L. Carroll, a writer who specialized in healthy and medicine, and she probably meant to write health, explains in his book. So present tense verb, but also notice in theory how appropriate this verb is. It's not a verb that is a little more forceful, like argues. It's not something as generic as says or writes. This word explains, I think, again, effectively suggests to you, the person reading it, what Carroll does in his piece, and by extension, what she hopes this source does in her essay. This is explanatory work she hopes to do, because again, she, at this point in the essay, because it's quite early in the essay, she's just creating a kind of foundation for some of the larger points she hopes to make. And something else that I really like about this essay, something that I think makes this essay effective as a research essay, and you could take the time to do this, just count how many in-text citations you see, because what that suggests is she relies quite heavily on the secondary sources, the researched material that she found for this essay. She is not, of course, always quoting directly from those sources. At times, the implication is that she's paraphrasing or summarizing, and go to the research essay module because, again, I provided some guidance about what that means. What are the differences between quoting directly from a text, paraphrasing a text, summarizing a text? But she effectively incorporates all of those different modalities for quoting from, for borrowing from secondary sources. But if we're just trying to imagine or envision, well, what is something that makes this, at least visually, an effective research essay? Just seeing how often she borrows from her secondary sources. Now, context matters, readability matters, of course, but seeing a fair number of citations is something that I certainly want from all of your essays. And again, I think it's something that Morgan does quite well. This is unmistakably a research essay. I don't think anyone could argue otherwise, even though, again, as I mentioned moments ago, there are narrative elements to this essay, which, understandably so, I can envision a lot of students thinking or imagining, the presence of narrative would somehow detract from the credibility of this essay as a research essay. Now, this is not, by my estimation, a flawless essay, even though I think it is quite good. I think it is an effective research essay. There are some things that I would bring to all of your attention, things possibly to avoid. Maybe the most important thing is the thesis statement itself. And again, please know and understand that you are not required to underline your thesis statement. If that would be helpful and useful for you in a rough draft, please feel free to do so, but do not think you need to do so for the final draft. If we look to the introduction, I'll read her thesis statement because it reads as follows. Dementia, a form of Alzheimer's, is gradually robbing me of my grandmother and my grandmother of her health, her future life, and her past memories. One of the things that I often like to talk to students about, and we've had these conversations progressively throughout the semester, is, well, what is a thesis statement? A thesis statement, there are a variety of different ways to define what a thesis statement is, but in the simplest terms, a thesis statement is an argumentative assertion. It is a claim you stake, develop, and support throughout an essay. And what's also important to remember is a thesis statement cannot be, in theory, a fact. Because again, if we're imagining, well, a thesis statement needs to be an argumentative assertion, we don't argue facts, at least, goodness, we shouldn't. We use facts to support our argumentative claims. We use facts to support our argumentative assertions. I say all of that because this thesis feels more like a fact and less like an argumentative assertion. When I talk to my students about this essay in my traditional non online courses, I ask them, well, what do we think makes this thesis statement feel less like an argumentative assertion and more like a fact? I think not, for example, having either access to her grandmother's medical records or even necessarily having the experience, the education, and the credentials to offer some sort of a counter diagnosis. Therefore, I think this thesis, again, if we imagine not so much things as binaries, either they are or they are not, but existing on a kind of continuum, I could I could imagine arguing that this thesis feels more like a fact than it does like a thesis. And interesting exercise, if you have the time, which I'm sure all of you do, right, is to envision or speculate, well, how could I, what sort of suggestions or what sorts of suggestions could I make to this student? What sorts of changes could make this thesis statement feel less like a fact and more like a thesis? But in summation, and here I'll transition in just a moment to one of the other pieces, I think this essay does so many things well. I think it's a research essay that, perhaps to your surprise, uses narrative as a pattern. This is something you can do. It's something that is certainly possible for a research essay, even if it seems like narrative would be the last pattern you would want to use for a research essay. I also think Morgan effectively incorporates borrowed material. There's a lot of citations here, and the way she introduces those citations, the signal phrases in particular, really strengthen this research essay, or strengthen this essay as a research essay, because this is an incredibly readable research essay. It's clear that Morgan has thought carefully about how she wants to not only introduce borrowed material, but how she wants to incorporate and integrate borrowed material. While I think there are some ways to envision strengthening this thesis, at least it has what the author thinks is a thesis statement. And when I read and assess the thesis statements for your essays, if you have a thesis, even if I think it's something, even if I think your thesis feels more like a fact and less like an argumentative assertion, I will certainly bring that to your attention. But we could say at the very least, it's preferable to have what you think is a thesis, even if it's a weak thesis, or even if it's a thesis that, again, feels less like an argumentative assertion and more like a fact. So read, reread, study this essay, because I think it has a lot that is quite useful to all of you. Now, let's spend a few minutes discussing the David Engl essay, Let Them Drink Water. Finding this essay will be a little different. You'll see when you click on the link to the essay, it will bring you to this Patterns for College Writing 12th edition PDF. You'll need to do a bit of searching, and I've provided some instructions for how to do that. But within the PDF itself, it begins on page 641, but if you look to the top left, the pagination that the actual PDF document creates, that is different. It's page 683. But again, I've provided some information about how to find it, how to navigate this PDF, because this reading assignment is slightly different. So, Engl, the first thing I want to bring to everyone's attention, and you can see this before the essay begins, this is an essay that Engl wrote for an online publication called Slate, and because of that, the citations look a little different. For example, Engl was not asked to use MLA citation standards. If you saw this on the website Slate, you would see, for example, hyperlinks. So keep that in mind. You won't see the sorts of parenthetical citations that you saw in the Morgan piece, nor will you see the sorts of parenthetical citations that I want to see in your essays. Keep that in mind. But one of the things that Ingber does that I would certainly encourage all of you to do, a certain inclination he has that I would encourage all of you to adopt. Much like Morgan, he so effectively introduces borrowed material. If you look, for example, let us go to, it's probably on page 2, paragraph 6. This is on page 642. Notice how he begins the paragraph, junk food literally. Junk food literally, quote, alters the biological circuitry of our brains, end quote, writes David Kessler in this summer's bestseller, The End of Overeating. So I'll stop there. I do often discourage students from beginning paragraphs with quotes, but Ingber does it quite effectively here. Again, much like Morgan, notice how we have a signal phrase. Now, the signal phrase follows the quote, which is certainly an option, but if you wanted to keep things simple, I would encourage you to adopt the process that I described earlier in this lecture, signal phrase followed by borrowed material, followed by citation. But again, notice how readable this is. This is part of what I like, and we see this consistently throughout the essay. When Ingber quotes from directly additional sources, secondary sources, borrowed material, the emphasis here is clearly on readability. We don't see, for example, Ingber quoting 2 or 3 pages without signal phrases, all of this. And one of the ways that you could envision what this can and should look like, imagine there are no quotation marks. Imagine the signal phrase does not exist. Would this still be readable? And I think it would be. You could imagine this sentence existing as follows. Junk food literally alters the biological circuitry of our brains. The sentence could easily end there. That is a fantastic way to check and see if you have incorporated borrowed material effectively. If I removed the quotation marks, if I removed the signal phrase, would it still make sense? Would the context still carry? And I think here it absolutely does. There are some additional fantastic examples of this. If you go to page 643, the paragraph that begins with, it's hard to draw a line. This is paragraph 9. He writes, it's hard to draw a line, though, between foods that are drugs and foods that are merely delicious. Again, fantastic signal phrase, fantastic topic sentence. This offers a clear indication of what Ingber hopes to address in this paragraph. Soda and candy aren't the only stimuli that, quote, rewire your brain, of course. Again, quotation marks here, but it's clear, it's concise. Coffee does too, and so do video games, Twitter, meditation, and just about anything else that might give you pleasure or pain. That's what our brains do. They learn, they rewire. To construe an earthly delight as hyper-palatable, as too good for our own good, we're lashing out at sensuality itself. Quote, do you design food specifically to be highly hedonic? End quote. Kessler asks an industry consultant at one point in the book. What's the guy going to say? Quote, no, we design food to be bland and nutritious. So again, the presence of quotation marks. Don't be surprised by the lack of citations because, again, Ingber was not asked to use MLA documentation and citation standards in the same way you are. But once again, we see how careful Ingber is when he chooses to incorporate borrowed material. It's incredibly readable. If we were, again, to test this paragraph in the same way that I've encouraged you to, let us remove any signal phrases, let us remove any quotation marks. Would the context still carry? Would this still make sense? And I think this is yet another example of, yes, it would. It absolutely would. So because of time constraints and considerations, I want to stop there. But again, quickly, in summation, a few of the things that I want you to know and understand, a few of the principles that I think the reading over the past 2 weeks teaches. First, this emphasis on readability. thinking carefully about how you incorporate borrowed material. Of course, always having signal phrases and in-text citations, but ensuring that, and the signal phrases in particular will help and assist with readability, but being as careful as possible, being as deliberate as possible with the incorporation of borrowed material. Even checking and testing. If I removed quotation marks with the context and specifically the signal phrases, would all of this still make sense? Would the context still carry? Could someone read this without signal phrases, without quotation marks, and still understand what I mean? Because if they can't, that may offer some indication of possible changes you should make on a kind of syntactical level to ensure that your essay is more readable. I think all of the reading over the last couple of weeks has effectively, more often than not, demonstrated that principle. What I think you'll also notice, and maybe this is specifically with the student essays, just how often they borrow from secondary sources. The excessive but necessary presence of those in-text citations, and ensuring that your citations match, your in-text citations match with your final works cited page. That relationship between in-text citation and full citation on the works cited page is so important and so essential, because that's how your reader, if they wanted to, can check and confirm that you are in fact borrowing correctly, that you have framed and cited everything correctly. The other thing that I think all of these essays do, again, to varying degrees of success, they at the very least have a kind of argumentative assertion, even if perhaps some of the thesis statements for the student essays could use a bit of work, even if they feel at times more like facts and less like argumentative assertions. Just thinking about the importance of making an argument that you are not, for example, writing an informative research essay, but you are writing instead an argumentative research essay. Therefore, you need to have some kind of a thesis statement. You need to do all of this research. You need to incorporate all of this borrowed material in the service of supporting a larger argumentative claim. And maybe the Engl, more so than the two student essays, effectively demonstrate how to do that, how you should do that. So, okay, with all that said, I think I'll end it here. As always, email me if and when you have questions. But for English 1010 here at Northeast State Community College, as you know, my name is Colin Cox. Have a nice day, have a nice week, and I will talk to you soon.